A German soldier opens a bar of chocolate and offers it to a French soldier, but the French soldier is worried it might be a trap. He gestures for the German to take a bite first. After all, just a moment ago, they were deadly enemies. To show his goodwill, the German soldier unhesitatingly breaks off a piece and eats it. Only then does the Frenchman feel safe enough to accept, and in return, he offers his 1982 vintage wine. Seeing this, a nearby Scottish soldier takes out a photo of his wife and shows it off to the German soldier. Afterwards, they used flares as fireworks and shared food in the no man's land between the three armies. They put down their coal guns and sang Christmas carols in the middle of the battlefield. Yet, this incredible scene actually happened in history. In July 1914, World War I broke out. France and Scotland formed an alliance to resist Germany, and the fighting on the Western Front was extremely fierce. 4 major battles almost razed this place to the ground, leaving only trenches for dodging bullets and fierce fighting. The war dragged on for 5 whole months, yet there was still no outcome. The prolonged stalemate left soldiers on all sides utterly exhausted. Everyone hoped the war would end soon, but it dragged on until Christmas Eve. As the holiday approached, homesickness and war weariness grew. All the soldiers wanted was to go home. The French officer told them, "Hold on a little longer. Once the night comes and the troops rotate, you can rest." Encouraged by these words, the soldiers began to pray, then fixed their bayonets to charge. At the lieutenant's command, they moved forward. The soldiers shouted as they leapt from trenches, but what greeted them was a barrage of artillery shells. Then, Maxim machine guns spat out streams of deadly fire, devouring the lives of one soldier after another. In an instant, over half the men were killed or wounded. What was even more absurd was that while soldiers fought desperately on the front lines, war leaders were celebrating the new year in royal palaces. On Christmas Eve, the German High Command sought to pacify the soldiers at the front. They specially sent a batch of Christmas trees to the front. When the soldiers saw them, a wave of homesickness overwhelmed them. A Scottish soldier played the bagpipes, the sound drifting across the battlefield on Christmas Eve. A German soldier started singing along and unconsciously walked out of his trench. In a war zone, such behavior was tantamount to offering oneself up to the enemy. Yet the British and French coalition forces across from him didn't fire, and even played bagpipes to accompany him. After the song ended, even the enemy couldn't help but applaud him. Then, the German soldiers raised the Christmas trees high and greeted the enemy in a friendly manner. "Segland, good evening, gentlemen." There were no English but Scots. At that moment, the atmosphere subtly changed. Officer House hurried to the center of the battlefield, urging him to quickly return to the trench. "Innovative, let's work." But just then, Lieutenant Gordon of the British Army walked over. Then, Lieutenant Audi of the French Army also approached. The soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. On the battlefield, they had never experienced anything like this before. It was like a summit meeting. "This war won't be decided tonight. I don't think anyone would."
Criticizes us for laying down our rifles on Christmas Eve.
"Don't you worry. It's only for this one night."
So, the British, French and Germans reached a gentleman's agreement to cease fire on Christmas Eve. Later, the French officer brought out champagne, raised a glass mid-battlefield, and celebrated their peace.
Merry Christmas.
They toasted and celebrated together. A soldier in the trench lit a flare, and the bright light lit the night sky like fireworks. The soldiers cheered excitedly, carefully climbed out of the trenches, and gathered in the middle of the battlefield. At that moment, they put aside their hateful gazes and walked together as one. There were no enemies, only ordinary people wounded by war. They left their loved ones and, armed with weapons, were swept into the war. They hated war and longed for peace just as much. Later, a German soldier shared some chocolate, and in return, received fine wine. They soon became familiar with each other. Then the German soldier took out a photo of his wife to show the French soldier. The Frenchman remarked, "Your wife is very beautiful." Then he showed a photo of his own wife to the German. The German replied, "Your wife is beautiful too." At that moment, they were like old friends reunited, drinking, singing, and sharing their hearts. Finally, they gathered for the priest's prayer, taking off their caps and setting aside their identities. In this moment, each of their hearts would be cleansed. The only difference was that this was happening on the battlefield. Soon, at midnight, the bells rang. They put their caps back on and headed back to camp. As they parted, they shared a reluctant glance. Such beauty was all too fleeting. They knew that once tonight ended, fate would make them enemies again on the battlefield. The next day, the Germans noticed someone digging a hole and thought the British were planting landmines. The three decided to shoot the British soldier who was digging. At that moment, a priest ran out, waving a white flag. They weren't laying mines, but digging up the bodies of fallen comrades. So the three leaders held a second conversation. This time, it was about the dead. After negotiation, they agreed to extend the ceasefire for another day, so that on Christmas, fallen soldiers from both sides could be buried together, regardless of nationality. Finally, accompanied by the sound of bagpipes playing the mass and the priest's prayers, the souls of the deceased were laid to rest. After burying the dead, with time remaining in the ceasefire, they held a soccer match on the battlefield. The soldiers sat together, without distinction, excitedly cheering for their own teams. In the end, the German team had a narrow competitive advantage and won the match by 3-2. After the game, the soldiers gathered in small groups, sharing drinks with one another, chatting, or sitting in shell craters engaging in games of cards. Everything seemed so harmonious and beautiful. The next morning, the ceasefire came to an end. Although none of the soldiers wanted to fight anymore, it was still a battlefield. At this moment, German headquarters ordered that in 10 minutes, they would shell the British and French Allied forces. After 2 ceasefires, the soldiers on both sides were now friends, and no one was willing to fight anymore. So, the German officer hurriedly ran to the British and French Allied trenches.
The artillery will start bombarding you in 10 minutes. If you'd like, I suggest you come. Take shelter in my trench.
You heard right. This is a true story that happened on a World War I battlefield. The British and French allies received the message and moved over at once. 10 minutes later, the fierce shelling really did begin as promised. Soldiers from all 3 countries crowded into the narrow trench and survived the bombardment. After the shelling subsided, the British officer suggested that the German soldiers come take shelter in their trench. Because, as was customary, after the Germans opened fire, the British and French allies would inevitably retaliate. So all the soldiers moved over to the British trench together. Listening to the overwhelming explosions, the soldiers once again survived the bombardment. As they parted, the officers of the 3 countries shook hands to express their gratitude, and the British soldiers even played the bagpipes, a symbol of everlasting friendship, quietly watching the Germans leave. Without the Christmas Eve truce, they might have already fallen in battle, their bodies covered by snow. Secretly relieved, the soldiers hurried to write letters home to reassure their families, mentioning the ceasefire. However, unexpectedly, the French government intercepted the letters en route. When various commanders learned this, they were furious and sent officers to the front to enforce the fighting. Soldiers no longer dared slack off. When a German soldier stepped out, the British commander ordered his men to fire. But the soldiers hesitated, unwilling to break the new peace. Pressured by their commander, they only fired into the sky, signaling the Germans to flee. This time, the commander was completely enraged and ordered a soldier to fire a shot. With no other choice, he had to obey the order. But the person who rushed out was a French officer, and the one killed was his subordinate. This soldier had been granted leave to visit his family. A German soldier kindly gave him a uniform for safe passage through the lines, but this led to a misunderstanding, and he was killed by the Allied British forces. The commander was utterly disappointed by the soldiers' earlier behavior. He felt these men were unfit for this front, so he sent them to deadlier fronts. Meanwhile, the French officer was also rebuked. The commander condemned their unauthorized ceasefire as treason, but the 2 men had very different perspectives.
I felt closer to the Germans than the anti-German shouters. Back home, warmed by their roasted turkeys.
The Russian officer was reassigned by headquarters because of the ceasefire. All German soldiers were sent to fight on the front line against the advancing Russian army, an even more brutal and dangerous environment. Although the train would pass through their own homeland, they had no chance to visit their families. Then, the commander viciously crushed the officer's harmonica, destroying their only source of spiritual comfort, and finally humiliated the officer too. After the commander stormed off, the soldiers once again began to hum Silent Night. The harmonica could be crushed, but the soldiers' longing for friendship could not be destroyed. War could devour their lives, but never extinguish the soldiers' hope for peace. In the end, the train pulled away toward a new front. Faced with the unknown, this film adapts a historical event that took place in a certain year,